March 15, 1943. Snow and mud mixed together on the frozen steppe of the Eastern Front. In a shallow foxhole near Kharkov, a young German soldier hunched against the biting wind. His uniform was stiff with dirt, his hands cracked and raw from weeks without warmth. From the inside pocket of his tunic, he drew out a letter, creased, smudged, and already read a dozen times. The paper trembled in his fingers, not from cold alone. Across its fragile surface, ink had blurred where a tear had fallen. The words, written in a mother's careful script, told of bread lines, of the family cow slaughtered for rations, of prayers whispered each night for his safe return. In that moment, far from the cities he once knew, the letter was more than paper. It was the last bridge to a world that still felt human. Thousands of miles away, in a barracks in North Africa, an American GI pressed a battered radio against his ear. Through the static came a woman's voice, warm and steady. A Hollywood actress speaking through the USO broadcast. Her tone carried laughter, encouragement, and a promise that the folks back home are proud of you. Around him, tired men in khaki lifted their heads. Some smiled faintly. Others simply closed their eyes and listened. In the dust and heat of the desert, the voice reminded them of streets filled with music, of dances, of faces waiting at train stations. These scenes played out across the world, in every corner of the war. For soldiers who lived day by day under artillery fire and endless marches, morale was as vital as food or ammunition. And in the midst of a conflict measured in tanks, planes, and death tolls, it was often women's voices that gave men the strength to endure. Letters tucked into breast pockets, songs drifting across radios, whispered prayers in hospital tents, all became weapons in a war not fought with steel, but with the spirit. A diary from the front recorded it plainly. The shells fall, but I read her words, and I remember why I must survive. To the men who held those words, survival was not only for themselves, but for those who had written to them. In London, British soldiers received parcels from wives and sisters with letters inside. One wrote back, "Your words are the light in this darkness." On the Soviet side, Red Army soldiers carried scraps of paper folded small enough to hide in their boots, letters that spoke of defiance, of children waiting in villages burned by retreating Germans. Everywhere, voices traveled through ink, through airwaves, through memory. The paradox was stark. Armies equipped with the most advanced weapons of the century were sustained by something as fragile as paper, as fleeting as song. And yet, this fragility carried more weight than steel. Even in the darkest moments, dialogue cut through despair. A nurse at a field hospital remembered telling a wounded soldier, "You will walk again. Your mother will see you." He looked at her, bleeding and broken, and whispered, "Say it again." For him, the words mattered more than the morphine. The war machine measured success in battles won and territory taken. But underneath, morale determined whether men stood their ground or faltered. And morale was not abstract. It was carried in the letters written by wives on rationed paper, in the voices of actresses and singers who never saw the front, in the quiet strength of mothers urging their sons to hold on. On that March day in 1943, the German soldier folded his letter carefully, pressing it close to his heart as the artillery roared again. In North Africa, the GI set the radio down with a half-smile, the actress's words still echoing in his mind. Neither man knew what tomorrow would bring, but in that fragile connection between home and battlefield, between women's voices and men's survival, lay the unseen fuel of the war. It was a reminder that in the age of total war, the most enduring power was not only in weapons, but in words. The war was not fought only with rifles and artillery. Across kitchen tables, in cramped post offices, and by candlelight in bomb shelters, another battle unfolded. A battle of words. For soldiers scattered across continents, letters were not simply correspondence. They were lifelines. Every major army built vast postal systems to keep this fragile thread unbroken. The German Feldpost moved nearly 2 billion letters each year, a staggering river of ink flowing between battlefronts and bombed-out cities. In Britain, the force's post office promised that even on distant outposts, soldiers would still hear from home. And in America, the ingenious V-mail system shrank letters onto microfilm, transported them across oceans, then reprinted them on lightweight sheets. Each slip of paper carried a piece of a world worth fighting for. For men at the front, these letters were talismans. Diaries from German and American soldiers alike described them as treasures more precious than rations. One wrote, "I read her words until the paper nearly fell apart. It smells faintly of home." Some letters were folded so often that the creases split. Others were tucked into helmets or tucked against the chest, a fragile shield of memory against the machinery of death. For the women who wrote them, the act was both duty and defiance. Wives censored their words, careful not to burden their husbands with the truth of bombings and shortages. A mother in Hamburg wrote only, "We are safe. Your father tends the garden still. Come home." Between the lines, her son could hear what was left unsaid. The hunger, the fear, the nights spent in shelters. In London, a young woman admitted the reality more plainly. "We sleep in the underground when the sirens wail. Your brother says he dreams of you every night." Even those stripped-down lines, unpolished and ordinary, became lifelines of extraordinary weight. The paradox was clear. Women who never held rifles still shaped the will of armies. The whispered encouragements, the promises of waiting sweethearts, the words of mothers, they held men in the fight when fatigue and terror tempted surrender. Commanders knew this. Censors screened every letter, not only to guard secrets but to protect morale. Too much despair could wound a soldier more than shrapnel. Yet even censored, the letters carried voices across impossible distances. In America, young wives joined victory mail clubs, writing to soldiers they had never met, reminding them that the nation was behind them. One soldier later said, "Her letter was the reason I believed in tomorrow." In Germany, young women trained in the Bund Deutscher Mädel wrote to wounded veterans in hospitals, their words echoing state propaganda but also carrying genuine warmth. Even propaganda could not disguise the humanity pressed into each line. Letters, in their simplicity, became psychological weapons. "We are proud of you. We miss you. You will return." These phrases carried as much force as artillery. They sustained men in trenches, on ships, and in bomber crews flying into flak-filled skies. Soldiers fought not for abstract causes alone, but for the people whose handwriting they traced in the dim glow of lanterns. At night, the sound of rustling paper in a barracks or a dugout was as common as the rattle of rifles. Soldiers leaned close, sharing fragments. "She says the harvest was good. My boy started school." For a moment, the war receded. Home was near, even if only in words. The continuity from foxholes to kitchen tables revealed a hidden truth. The most decisive battles for morale were fought with ink and paper, across oceans and borders, by women who carried their families through fear and famine. In the hands of soldiers, these letters were more than words. They were the voices that kept them fighting. The crackle of radio static was as familiar to soldiers as the rattle of gunfire. Across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, men huddled around battered sets or portable gramophones, waiting for a voice that could cut through the fog of war. These voices did not fire bullets or drop bombs, yet their power was undeniable. From the Allied side came songs of comfort and defiance. Vera Lynn, the force's sweetheart, sang of reunion in "We'll Meet Again," her gentle tone becoming a hymn of survival. For British airmen flying missions over Germany, her voice seemed to float above the roar of engines, promising that beyond the smoke and flames lay a future worth enduring. American GIs, stationed far from home, found strength in Marlene Dietrich's sultry renditions of Lily Marlene. Though German-born, Dietrich had defected from the Reich, and her performances for USO tours and broadcasts became an act of defiance against Hitler. Every note, one GI recalled, was like a reminder that even beauty had chosen our side. But the airwaves were also a battlefield of deception. The Axis powers deployed women to weaponize intimacy, turning warmth into doubt. In the Pacific, Tokyo Rose, a collective name given to several English-speaking Japanese women, broadcast music and commentary aimed at American troops. Her words dripped with irony. "How are you boys enjoying your lonely nights? Your sweethearts are dancing with someone else." The goal was simple: erode faith, seed despair, and whisper that the war was already lost. In Europe, German propaganda unleashed Axis Sally, the American-born broadcaster Mildred Gillers. Her calm, almost motherly delivery carried a poison wrapped in comfort. "Why die for Roosevelt's lies?" she would ask, blending swing music with subtle barbs meant to gnaw at American resolve. Some GIs laughed it off, mocking her as a sideshow. Others admitted, in quiet moments, that her words left shadows in their thoughts. The paradox of these broadcasts lay in their intimacy. A single voice, carried through tinny speakers, could feel more personal than the orders of generals. For Allied soldiers, the warm tones of Lynn or Dietrich became reminders of home and humanity. For Axis strategists, the calculated whispers of Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally were weapons designed to pierce loneliness. Sound traveled further than artillery, slipping past barbed wire and censorship to nestle in the private corners of a soldier's mind. Testimonies reveal just how powerful these voices became. One American in the Pacific confessed that he listened to Tokyo Rose every night, even though he knew it was propaganda. "She made us laugh. Sometimes she made us angry. But always, she made us listen." German soldiers on the Eastern Front admitted to treasuring Dietrich's Lily Marlene, even when it came through Allied channels, proof that music itself, regardless of origin, could cross enemy lines. For women, stepping into the world of radio was itself an act of courage. Their voices became symbols, magnified across battlefields. To sing, to speak, to broadcast was to shoulder the burden of morale. They were entertainers and propagandists, comforters and manipulators. In war, they were never neutral. The chapter closes with the echo of a soldier's diary entry. "The bombs shook the ground, but her song shook my heart. It kept me standing." Whether meant to heal or to wound, the voices on the airwaves proved one thing: in the greatest war of the century, the human spirit could be lifted or shattered by nothing more than a song. The battlefield did not end at the trench line. It carried into the tents, the hospital ships, and the converted schoolhouses where the wounded lay in rows, waiting for hands that could hold life together. There, amid the smell of iodine and blood, it was not only the surgeon's scalpel or the morphine syringe that gave hope, it was the voices, steady, soothing, insistent, that carried men back from the edge of despair. In Stalingrad, a Soviet nurse bent over a boy no older than 16, his leg shattered beyond repair. With no anesthetic left, she pressed his hand into hers and whispered through the roar of artillery, "You will walk again. You will see your mother again." He clung to those words as the bone saw bit into his flesh. On a hospital ship crossing the Channel after D-Day, American nurses worked through the night as stretcher after stretcher arrived from Normandy. Oil lamps flickered with every sway of the vessel. The ship's loudspeaker carried orders, but in the wards it was the soft lull of women's voices that mattered most. Some read letters sent from home. Others sang quietly, masking the guttural cries of men undergoing surgery without ether. One GI recalled later, "The sound of her voice cut through the pain. I held on to that voice more than the morphine." The British, too, carried their morale into wards as surely as they did into air raids. Vera Lynn's songs played on gramophones, but in field hospitals, it was the nurses who carried those promises directly into the ears of men fading in and out of consciousness. "We'll meet again," they sang softly, not as a performance, but as a prayer. Even on the other side, German nurses stood in blood-soaked stations from the Eastern Front to the bombed ruins of Berlin. They were called Engel der Front, angels of the front. Yet their halos were forged not in triumph, but in endurance. Diaries reveal their exhaustion, nights without sleep, days without food, and the endless chorus of screams. Still, they spoke words of encouragement to soldiers broken by frostbite, typhus, or shrapnel wounds. They could not promise victory, but they could promise dignity. What united these women across uniforms and allegiances was not the power to end the war, but the ability to steady the human spirit within it. They bore witness to men who believed they would never again see their homes. They coaxed them back with fragments of memory, mothers' kitchens, children's laughter, the smell of spring in villages far away. The paradox was clear. These women were non-combatants, yet they fought their own battle with every word spoken at the bedside. While soldiers carried rifles, nurses carried voices sharp enough to cut through fear. In the chaos of triage, bandages soaked through, stretchers piled in doorways, the simple words, "Hold on," became a weapon against death. And sometimes, silence was their greatest act of speech. A hand resting on a soldier's chest, a steady gaze that said without words, "You are not alone." By the war's end, the image of the nurse had become iconic. Not only the uniformed woman with a red cross on her arm, but the voice that sustained men when their own strength failed. They did not command battalions, but they carried armies forward, one whispered promise at a time. The Reich's grip on Europe was iron, but words could still slip through its fingers. In the back rooms of cafes, in dimly lit attics, in the whispered exchanges on crowded trains, women carried messages that were as dangerous as dynamite. To speak, to write, to sing, these acts became weapons of defiance. In occupied France, Lucie Aubrac stood before a room of exhausted fighters in a hidden safe house. German patrols marched just blocks away, yet her voice rose above the silence. "This is not the end. We fight because our children deserve freedom." Her speeches spread not through newspapers, but through word of mouth, igniting courage in men who had almost given up. In Warsaw, young women disguised as peasants smuggled notes sewn into hems and messages inked onto scraps of paper. Couriers like Zofia Kosek carried underground bulletins through Gestapo checkpoints, knowing that one slip of the hand could mean interrogation and execution. Yet she wrote that words mattered as much as bullets. A gun kills one enemy. A message saves 100 souls from surrender. Resistance newspapers, typed on smuggled paper, copied by hand, and passed beneath tables, were often written, edited, and distributed by women. Each issue carried news from the BBC, stories of sabotage, and instructions for survival. To read one was to risk arrest. To write one was to risk death. Yet the presses ran, powered by the resolve of women who refused to let silence win. Even songs became acts of rebellion. In occupied Norway and the Netherlands, lullabies carried coded meanings. A children's rhyme, sung softly in kitchens, could signal that resistance fighters had passed safely through town. In Poland, whispers of the national anthem spread from cell to cell in concentration camps. The Gestapo knew the danger of these melodies. To silence a song, they unleashed arrests and torture. But the songs returned, stronger than before. Testimonies from survivors reveal how morale itself became a battlefield. A soldier might survive hunger and frostbite, but without hope, he was already defeated. Women understood this, and they turned their voices into lifelines. One French courier recalled being caught with leaflets tucked into her bicycle frame. Beaten and interrogated, she refused to give up her network. Later, she explained, "If I could not fight with a rifle, I would fight with silence." The Gestapo recognized the threat. Female voices could inspire uprisings as effectively as guns. They infiltrated circles, planted informants, and staged raids. Still, women returned to their typewriters, their bicycles, their whispered songs. Each act was a gamble, but also a declaration that tyranny could not control the spirit of a people. By 1944, the tide of war was turning. Yet, for those in the underground, every day was still survival. Words remained as vital as food, for without them fighters would have no cause to cling to. Morale was not a luxury. It was a weapon, carried most often by women who risked everything for the simple right to speak. In the silence of occupied cities, their voices became echoes of defiance. They were not generals, nor soldiers with medals, but their words outlived bullets, fueling an unbroken spirit that even the Reich could not crush. By 1944, the war was a contest not only of firepower, but of spirit. Armies stretched thin across continents fought battles as much inside the mind as on the battlefield. Exhaustion crept into every trench, every foxhole, every camp. The war's turning point was measured in voices, some that sustained, others that shattered hope. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers opened Feldpost letters from home. Instead of encouragement, many read of hunger and bombings, of children foraging for scraps in ruins. A soldier scrawled in his diary, "If even our mothers have no bread, what are we fighting for?" The Reich's promise of invincibility collapsed, with every inked word describing starvation and despair. Across the Channel, Allied forces heard a different tone. Roosevelt's fireside chats, broadcast to foxholes by crackling radios, assured soldiers that the world beyond the front had not forgotten them. A GI later recalled, "It felt like he was speaking to us alone, telling us to hold just a little longer." Letters carried across the Atlantic in the American V-mail system bore simple messages. "We are waiting. We love you." That became lifelines more potent than rations. In prisoner of war camps, survival hinged on whispers. Nurses moved quietly between cots, telling captured men that liberation was near, that the Red Cross had not abandoned them. One prisoner remembered the words of a British nurse who leaned close during a fevered night. "Don't give in. The world is still out there." Such whispers were as vital as medicine, binding men to hope in the face of starvation and disease. But morale was also attacked with equal force. Axis propagandists like Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally filled airwaves with seductive voices, reminding Allied troops of their distance from home, sowing seeds of doubt. "Your wives dance while you freeze in foreign mud." For some, it gnawed at loyalty. For many more, it hardened resolve. The Reich itself was undone by a collapse of spirit. Reports from 1944 described desertion rates rising, even in elite units. Soldiers who once marched with fanatical belief now faltered when letters revealed the truth. Cities leveled, families scattered, defeat inevitable. In contrast, the Allies' morale held through fatigue and fear, lifted by an unbroken chain of words, songs, and speeches. This was the paradox of morale, intangible yet decisive. It could not be measured like tanks or planes. Yet its absence could collapse divisions, and its presence could carry men across oceans of blood and fire. By the summer of 1944, the difference was stark. The Wehrmacht cracked, and the Allied advance surged, not only through artillery, but through the endurance of hearts sustained by unseen voices. The turning point of the war was not merely on the beaches of Normandy or in the streets of Warsaw. It was in the letters clutched like talismans, in the voices that refused to fall silent, in the words that made soldiers rise when everything else told them to surrender. In this unseen battle of morale, women's voices carried armies to the final push. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, monuments rose in stone and bronze, generals on horseback, tanks carved into granite, soldiers cast in eternal march. Yet the voices that had carried armies through despair were harder to memorialize. Words could not be set in marble as easily as steel. And for decades, the women who had written, sung, whispered, or defied were left in the shadows of history. Slowly, their echoes began to emerge. In Britain, Vera Lynn's voice never disappeared. Her song, We'll Meet Again, became an anthem of remembrance, sung not only in wartime dance halls, but at ceremonies decades later, binding generations to the memory of endurance. In France, the diaries of resistance fighters like Lucie Aubrac were published, revealing how a whispered speech in a darkened cellar could rally courage as surely as a rifle. In Poland, underground couriers once faceless in Gestapo reports became names etched in archives, their coded messages now honored as acts of defiance. Nurses' words, once spoken over the cries of battlefield hospitals, resurfaced in oral histories. In St. Lo, survivors remembered the soft promise of a British nurse who whispered, "You will see your children again." Such testimonies, recorded decades later, reminded the world that wars were fought not only with artillery, but with fragments of hope delivered in the gentlest of tones. The camera of memory returns to the foxhole, where a German soldier clutched a crumpled letter from home, the ink blurred by damp earth and tears. It drifts to the Pacific, where an American GI leaned against sandbags, listening through static to a Hollywood actress's broadcast, her voice carrying across oceans. It lingers in a field hospital, where a nurse steadied a trembling hand and promised survival when none seemed possible. These moments, scattered across continents, shared a single thread. Fragile voices stronger than fear. The paradox endures. In a war defined by steel, fire, and machines of destruction, it was often words, spoken, sung, or scribbled, that carried men through nights of despair. Voices became weapons of endurance, intangible yet decisive, carving a path through the ruins of Europe and the Pacific alike. Today, statues stand not only for generals but for nurses, resistance fighters, and factory workers. Memorials to women's roles in war are unveiled in quiet town squares and national capitals, while archives preserve the letters once stained by blood and smoke. Their legacy is not silence, but testimony. The hidden war of morale reshaped how history remembers the fight against Hitler. Beyond the battlefield, the true victory was survival, carried in voices that refused to fade.